What a wonderful privilege to be with you all, and what a magnificent choir. That was incredible. A genuine delight to be with you. A few years ago, I was coming back from Brussels to London on the Eurostar. If you've ever been on that train, you come into St. Pancras Station past very dilapidated Victorian buildings, and one of them was splattered with graffiti. But you could see this quite clearly. You only live once, and it doesn't last. So live it up, drink it down, laugh it off, burn it at both ends. You can't take it with you. You only live once. Some of you will recognize that's crazy philosophy, the so-called YOLO philosophy, which is kind of a bastard version of Epicurus, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. It didn't last very long. It was very shallow. But I've been very intrigued, having lived in this country now for 30 years as a European admirer. There's a great emphasis, rightly, on people thinking Christianly and developing a Christian mind to look at the modern world. But one of the things almost always missing is a biblical sense of time. The Bible is filled with a sense of time, history, generations, days, moments, hours. Many of them are positive. You have the men of David who were skilled in reading the signs of the times. Or the famous verse for Esther. Who knows you haven't come to the kingdom for such a time as this? But of course there are many negative ones. In the Old Testament, Jeremiah taunts the Pharaoh of his day, King Bombast, one version puts it, the man who missed his moment. And of course, no one can read the New Testament, especially the Gospels, without seeing our Lord again and again and again, rebuking his generation because, as one version puts it, you missed God's moment when it came. Or our Lord says, you can read the weather, you're all good meteorologists, but you don't read the signs of the times. So our Lord's generation simply didn't get him. But the most positive one in the New Testament is the one I'd hoped Bob would read, but there must have been some mix-up. It's in Acts 13, not 16. Acts 13 is a very important chapter in the book. It's the story of the very first Christian mission. It's the chapter where Saul starts as Saul, also called Paul, and by the end he's only called Paul, and so on. It's a very, very important chapter. But the heart of it is, Paul is in Antioch, not his hometown Antioch, Pisidian Antioch, and he's there as a Jew on the Sabbath. And the ruler of the synagogue says to Paul, as a visitor, would you like to say anything? Imagine asking the Apostle Paul if he wants to say anything. He does, at great length. And most of the chapter is his grand survey of the Jewish people. And he builds to a climax, contrasting great King David with King David's greatest son, Jesus. But in the middle of this extraordinary sermon, there's a little throwaway line that many people miss altogether. Paul says about David, after he'd served God's purpose in his own generation, fell asleep. After he'd served God's purpose in his own generation, fell asleep. I'm not a pastor. I'm not a theologian. You don't need any biblical understanding to interpret that. There's nothing abstract or arcane or theological about that sentence. Very simple. But put it together, and the challenge of living like Paul says David lived is a tough one. How do we live today to serve God's purpose in our generation, which is an extraordinary one? Now, let me just point out some simple things in that very simple, brief verse. First, the surprising tribute. In the ancient world, kings were there to be served, not to serve. And yet that's the word used of King David. Historians and others say that if you look at the ancient world, most of the ways of government were hierarchical, based on power. So you look at the Great Pyramid of Giza, which I'm sure many of you have seen, or the ancient ziggurats, or the few that are left in what's now Iraq. They go up and up and up and up and up, millions of stones in the Great Pyramid. And the top stone, everyone supports it. And that was a picture in stone of the Pharaoh. Everyone underneath him, everyone there to support and serve him. And of course, that's the normal thing. You come to Plato, for example. There are three types of people: gold people and silver people and bronze people. Or his disciple Aristotle says, if you look at government, some are born to rule and others are born to be ruled. And that was the common idea. God rules the universe, the sun rules the heavens, the lion rules the animal world, and kings rule their people. And the people are there to serve him. That's the normal way throughout most of history. And yet here, David served. Now, the first person in history who was a great leader described like that, of course, is Moses. And 18 times you have the sense Moses is a servant of the Lord, but a servant of his people. Now, Greenleaf brought in the idea of servant leadership back in the 1950s, and he related it, oddly, to Buddhism. But if you look at it, it's actually rooted in the Jewish understanding of leadership, that leaders are there to serve the Lord and to serve their people. It's not about them. There's no narcissism in the biblical ideas of leadership. Now think of all the words you might have chose of David. Here he is, the precocious teenage giant killer, the rebel chieftain, the founder of a great dynasty and a warrior, and of course, too, the sweet singer of Israel, whose poems we still love today. Think of what you might have said as verbs. He fought, he conquered, he danced, he sang, he ruled, you name it. And Paul chooses served. Now, probably he's thinking of our Lord. Jesus says, I came not to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. And that idea runs through Paul, amazingly, when he writes to the first group of Christians in Europe. Paul says, you've turned from the false gods to, what's he going to say now? Follow or worship? No, he says to serve the living God. And so to be a follower of Jesus is to be a servant. It was a surprising tribute. But there's another simple point in the verse. A strategic task. He served God's purpose in his generation. Now, we're part of the Western world, which has been shaped by the Jewish and Christian faiths. But remember, for most of history, people didn't have a sense that history was going somewhere. I grew up in Asia, in a Buddhist culture. When I was in my 20s, I studied under a guru in India. As you know, in the Eastern religions, history is not moving somewhere, it's cyclical. Things like reincarnation. There's not a high view of history or the purpose of history. Or you look around, say, to atheists today. Their view is not cyclical like the East, it's what's called chronological. You just have the tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock of basic time. There's no meaning to it all. If humans want meaning in history, they have to impose their will on history. Not easy to do. And that idea that we're masters of history keeps getting interrupted and disrupted by events and so on. The biblical view is quite different. Not cyclical, Not purely chronological, but as the Jews call it, covenantal. In other words, God's providence is over the whole of history. He's the executive sovereign of history. But as we come to know him and love him and trust him and obey him, we can enter into his purposes in our small areas through our individual callings, and then we become partners. That's where the idea of the covenantal. He's providentially in control, but we play our little part too, and so we can serve God's purpose in our generation. Now think of Shakespeare. What's history? A tale told by an idiot. Sound and fury signifying nothing. Not for us who are followers of Jesus, no. We don't understand all that God is doing at any time, but we're doing our part. And as we do that, we're working out God's ends in history, and we have this strategic task in our time to serve God's purpose in our generation. A third simple little idea in the verse. A simple terminus to it all. The verse says simply, Paul says, after David had done all that, he fell asleep. None of us are here very long. And David wasn't. Now, of course, Paul is using a euphemism. Now, I know you Americans often use euphemisms for all sorts of things. I remember the first time I came to this country, I landed at JFK, amazed at all the swimming pools and so on one saw down coming in. And then the first sign I saw was a restroom. I thought, how nice that people after a long flight are offering you a restroom. I had no idea. But in England, we're much more blunt about things. Paul might have said, if he was English, David, after he'd served God's purpose, kicked the bucket or croaked. We have a whole range of words bluntly. In Americans, you just say quietly, passed. But clearly, Paul is using a euphemism. David fell asleep. But if you know your early church history, that was a euphemism with a strong theological foundation. Why? The time will come for all of us. We won't be here. And one night, just as last night we put our heads in the pillow, not fearful about waking up this morning, those who put their trust in Jesus will put their heads on the pillow at the end of life and wake up to be with our Lord. And as you know, I love the fact that the early church at their funerals, often they didn't say, good night, brother. They didn't say goodbye, brother, or goodbye, sister. What they said was, good night, sister, good night, brother. Because people who died trusting in Jesus would wake up to be with him. Now, have you ever thought that what Paul said about David should be a challenge for every single one of us today? Now, I'll argue as we go into the second service, we are living in what's called a civilizational moment. A moment in Western civilization of critical transition, which either leads on to renewal or down towards decline. Because the Western civilization has abandoned the faith that made it a civilization. But let's come closer to home. The United States is the world's lead society. Leader of the West, leader of the world. But America is increasingly opposed to the faith that made it and also to the revolution that made it. So the American Republic, too, is an extraordinary turning point in these few years. And all of you who are responsible citizens in this country have a part to play. And of course, that makes us think, what to each of us, as we come to know the Lord and trust him and obey him, What is our calling? The gifts God has given us, the spheres in which He's put us, in which we can stand up and speak out, be the salt and light that He calls us to be. Every generation of followers of Jesus is called to serve His purposes in His generation and their generation. But ours happens to be a most extraordinary generation in history. One of the saddest expressions of time in the New Testament is our Lord weeping over Jerusalem. You remember that day? He rounds the bend on the Mount of Olives and he sees the city down there and he bursts into tears. And as one version puts it, all because you missed God's moment when it came. Now, if you read the passage carefully, our Lord sees not just one time, but 3 times. He's looking out on a Palm Sunday, 80, 30, 31, 33, whatever it was. That's the immediate thing our Lord sees. But he also sees AD 70 with the sack of Jerusalem by the Romans and the terrible destruction with nearly 1 million Jews slaughtered. And he can see that, and not one stone is going to be left standing on another of this great temple that they looked at down the road. But our Lord, interestingly, sees not only his immediate time, and then AD 70 and perhaps AD 133, our Lord sees another time too, because he talked about missing the way that would have led to peace. In other words, as he arrived to bring the good news of God to his people, there was a moment, we're not sure when, the Bible doesn't spell it out, when they might have truly accepted him. But they missed the way that led to peace. And they went on to AD 70. Now, I'm not saying we understand our generation perfectly. Only the Lord does. But we're called to be faithful in the spheres in which we're living. But often in Washington, I'm sometimes overwhelmed with sadness. Sometimes, let me be clear, with outrage. Because so many people are not interested in understanding this time in which we're living and really standing up and speaking out responsibly with the issues that are at stake. And I just say to you, dear brothers and sisters here at Ocean Reef, with all the privilege of this wonderful place to enjoy, by God's grace, don't miss God's moment for our world, for the West, and for America as it's coming now. David served God's purpose in his generation and fell asleep. And the greatest thing we can ever hear from our Lord is when we see him face to face and he says, "Well done, good and faithful servant." May that be what you hear and not our Lord's regret that we've missed God's moment when it came.